Understanding all of the various Christian, Muslim, and Mongol dynasties and pseudo-political states of the High Middle Ages creates a dizzying array of names and groups. One interesting group that stands out beyond its actual sphere of influence on history is that of the Nizari state. This Shia group emerged around 1090 and operated until being massacred by the Mongols in 1273. The most famous Nizari of the Middle Ages is arguably Altair ibn Allahabad, a protagonist in the popular video game series Assassin's Creed. The Nizari state was home of the Order of Assassins, who maintained strongholds in mountainside fortresses and carried out systematic executions of their enemies using daggers for a close proximity kill. The Assassins conducted their most successful and high-profile operations in the early 12th century, primarily targeting high-profile Sunni Muslims of the Seljuk Empire. Their first known Christian victim was Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, in 1152. They unsuccessfully carried out attempts to kill the famous Sunni Ayyubid leader Saladin. The Seljuk Empire by this time had given away to the Ayyubids in the west and the Khwarezm Empire in the east. Yet another Sunni Ismail power, the Khwarezms, became the new enemy surrounding the Persian branch of the Nizaris. Yet at the turn of the 13th century, we need to look further east to the Mongols as Genghis Khan began his advances from the Mongolian steppes. As such, the attempt to kill Genghis Khan by the Order of the Assassins is likely an invention of fiction by the writers of Assassin's Creed. And by the time of his death in 1227, the Nizaris were quite weak. Genghis Khan quickly conquered the Khwarezm Empire, leaving the Nizaris secure in their mountain fortresses for the time being. Ogedei Khan, the son of Genghis Khan, expanded the Mongol Empire further and was succeeded by two more grandsons of Genghis Khan before the lack of a succession plan in 1259 led to the division of the empire into four khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, led by Kublai Khan, the Golden Horde through the Russian steppe encompassing the Kievan Rus, led by Baku Khan, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate running south of the Caspian Sea from Persia to Asia Minor. The Ilkhanate met the new Islamic Caliphate of the Mamluks in Egypt. The Mamluks were military slaves turned sultans who took over the Ayyubid Caliphate. Two prominent Mamluks, Qutuz and Baibars, beat back the Ilkhanate in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut. Baibars led the Mamluks to nearly destroy the remaining Crusader state territory in the Levant, leading to the 8th and 9th Crusades. A year after the Statute of Marlborough, Lord Edward of England took the cross, committing to a crusade. He intended to join King Louis IX of France, but that effort was diverted after the death of the future saint in 1270 in Tunis. Edward went on to Accra in the Holy Land, but his efforts led to a stalemate against Baibars. After negotiating a truce with the Mamluks in 1272, Edward personally thwarted an attempt on his life that may well have been the last known attack of the Nizari Order of the Assassins. Edward killed his assailant and fled from Accra to Cyprus to recuperate. A month later, he learned the death of his father, King Henry III. The Nizari state had been destroyed, but their lineage of imams continued on. These imams traced their history back to the unbroken line of Ali, the son and cousin of Muhammad himself. Aga Khan IV is the current Nizari imam and is also descended from the royal line of the Persian Qajar dynasty. He is one of the richest men in the world today, competed in the 1964 Olympics, and graduated with honors from Harvard University.
Welcome to the History of Modern Politics. That was Matt Whitlow with your cold open, and my name is Chris Spangle, and thank you so much for being with us here on episode 2 of season 2. It feels a little weird, Matt, because we are recording this roughly, 8 years?
4 or 3, but yeah, it's been a little long.
Yeah, we recorded episode 1 of season 2 and then took a very long break to continue working on this, and then life got in the way for a lot of reasons. But I remember reading that cold open and going, I'm making Matt do that one. I'm not going to be able to pronounce any of those names. So you did a great job with it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
One quick correction in there. Ali was the son-in-law of Muhammad. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yes, so we want to try to be as accurate as possible.
I love it when you fact check me real time, Chris.
Well, I'm just reading the facts you wrote. So we are talking today about Edward the First and his son Edward the Second, and the first 30 years or so of his son Edward the Third. So this Edwardian period has a lot of developments for modern politics. And so, Matt, let's just jump right into it, and let's start talking about the continued development of Parliament as an institution and activity in foreign affairs, which you alluded to, and the ongoing struggle between the kings and their barons in England.
Yeah, coming back from where we left off of the mention in the cold open, sometime after recuperating in Cyprus, which was ruled by the Crusader king of Jerusalem, who was in exile and happened to be from the branch of the house of Lusignan, Lord Edward went on to Sicily. And if you recall, Henry III had stirred up his barons by trying to put Edward's younger brother Edmund on the throne of Sicily. And then after that failed attempt, the Pope had turned to the younger brother of King Louis IX of France, the Charles of Anjou. So we're not going to talk in depth about him, but he became quite influential in that ongoing Guelph-Ghibelline conflict in northern Italy, and his descendants rose to power later in Eastern Europe, interestingly enough. So while in Sicily, though, Edward received news of his father's death, and notably Edward would then take his time returning home, as he was the clear and undisputed successor to the throne, somewhat a rarity at this time in England. Robert Burnell, who we mentioned briefly at the end of our last episode, would oversee the regency while Edward made his way home, and he would receive his grand coronation in August of 1274 at the ripe young age, well, actually not that young at this time, of 33.
That's roughly 78 in today's terms.
Right.
Especially for a king. King Edward I and his Lord High Chancellor Robert Burnell would quickly institute a new era of expansion in English law. And this is key from a political history perspective because it rapidly expanded upon the formal written legal structures that had taken root under the reign of Henry II. And it was also a response to the Magna Carta and the series of laws that had come to pass over the later reign of Henry III, which we had discussed in episode 11. So go back and check that out. And King Edward and Burnell learned the lessons of the last 60 years, which included the real birth of Parliament, 2 baronial rebellions, the establishment of the Magna Carta that codified law with the assent of the barons. It codified the law that the assent of the barons would be necessary to confirm royal power while maintaining a balance with the people of the realm. So let's cover, Matt, in depth well, maybe not too in-depth, but
Yeah.
more in-depth than your typical podcast, a summary of these key legal developments.
Yeah, these are some key things that start really establishing what the future of England is going to look like. So the Statute of Westminster, we've all heard of Westminster, in 1275 was the first significant collection of articles accepted by Parliament and put forth by Edward. So this took the form of 51 chapters, which in one source I found came out to be about 70 pages of a book to contain the entire text. So a lot of content here, codifying a lot of what was already understood as, quote, the law. This section on free elections remains in force still today in the United Kingdom. And most of the chapters remained in force until the Statute of Law Revision Act of 1863.
So then we move on to the Statute of Gloucester of 1278. It focused on feudal property law, inheritance, and the need for the current tenant of the land to ensure the value of the property is maintained and not destroyed. And it also established a system of heirs, royal judges touring from place to hear cases, notably for writs of quo warranto. The concept of quo warranto, which translates by what warrant, is to make the landowner or tenant prove the means by which they are entitled to the land. And this was beneficial to the barons to better maintain the value of their land and income, and also for the king, who would be able to reclaim lands that could not be provenly legally to be held by the Lord. Because in those days, you didn't have Facebook to track people's genealogy.
That's right. And then we follow up with the Statutes of Mortimer, first in 1279 and then a later one in 1290, which addressed the thorny issue of land ownership in the balance of the royal and church power. So Mortimer, or dead hand, confirmed the prohibition of passing feudal lands to the church. So this would be done to avoid feudal obligations like taxes, military service, etc., to happen in perpetuity, as the church never dies, just the feudal obligations.
Today we refer to those as foundations, so rich people just put it there.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they give it to the church. Then we move on to the Statute of Merchants in 1283 and 1285, which allowed creditors of merchants to be able to seize property as an alternative for the non-repayment of debt.
Yep, and then the next one is another statute of Westminster, this time passed in 1285, another massive 50-chapter collection of law that largely addressed and codified practices around laws of inheritance and property ownership. It should be noted here that most of the property in the English system was not transferable by sale. Land could not be sold because everyone essentially legally held land as a grant from their feudal overlords, so they don't truly own it. It's a grant. And this construct kept estates kind of in the family by way of inheritance, or in the absence of the heir, the property would revert back to the overlord. So the only way to transfer property would be through a means of sub-infeudation, which is where the contract under the new tenant would have an obligation to the holder of the property.
So then moving on to later in 1285, the Statute of Winchester was passed, and this addressed the common nature of law enforcement, which created a collective responsibility in the 100, which was a measurement of the woods, right? Responsibility in the 100 to aid in the apprehension of a criminal who was caught in the act by a witness. And the witness could call upon bystanders to assist in catching the assailant, because you didn't have organized law enforcement. You didn't have necessarily standing armies in those days. It's much different than what we have now.
Yeah. And many elements of land and property law were addressed again in the 1290 version of yet another statute of Westminster.
What's going on there? What's happening in Westminster?
Well, lots of that's where Parliament was often being held, right? So they just gave it the name. These are also referred to as the quia emptoris, roughly translated to because of the buyers. The increasing practice of having land change hands due to a rising merchant and trading class caused Edward to further elaborate the laws. So a side effect of all this was the more powerful lords would become even more powerful as wealth grew in the lands to be held. This began to create more loyalty and connection to the Lord's people, rather than from the Lord's people to the Lord himself rather than the king, which, kings don't really like. So this would later have a significant effect on the ongoing history of England.
So finally, while not actually a law, it is worth mentioning the taxes by the form of custom duties on wool enacted by Edward. We'll talk about the reasons for this later in the episode, but the taxes were unpopular, becoming referred to as the Maltat or bad tax from 1294 to 1297. And this was a culmination of royal authority now legally enacted through the combination of statutes that we just discussed, but in excess, nearly leading to another baronial revolt. So to see how that happened, let's now move on to the military campaigns of Edward I.
Yeah, the first part of Edward's reign also centered around Wales. So at the time of Edward's coronation, Llewellyn ap Gruffudd was the Prince of Wales, holding territory in the northwest of Wales, where the vassals were kind of holding power in the central region. So the English marcher lords held fiefs in the southern Welsh area, with the northeast being the royal domain of the English crown. So Llewellyn then had aligned with Simon de Montfort, who had betrothed his daughter. We talked about this a little in the last episode, who also happened to be the cousin of King Edward to Llewellyn. So Edward aimed to block this marriage as Llewellyn failed to perform homage to the king, which was a condition of the most recent treaty between his father Henry III and Llewellyn. So Edward mustered forces along with the Marcher Lords, and quickly pushed Llewellyn back into a corner. He surrendered in 1277 with just small territory of land left under his control. His younger brother, who had been aligned with Edward in this battle, became discontented with the share of the spoils, and the two brothers made another push against the English a few years later. This proved unsuccessful for the Welsh and ended with complete English control of the region with the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284. So Wales has now effectively lost all independence.
Yeah, poor the Welsh got a raw deal being settled next to the English. They didn't have the ability to fight back like the Scots. Edward began a massive building project of new castles in Wales to fortify the English position, aka to impose his will, as we've heard in previous episodes. So these castles are recognized today as UNESCO World Heritage Sites by UNESCO as the finest examples of the late 13th century and early 14th century military architecture in Europe, close quote. As King Edward defeated the Welsh, he supposedly made the following promise to the people of Wales. They would receive a new Prince of Wales that was born in Wales and could speak never a word of English. This would turn out to be his own son, who would be known as Edward Carnarvon, who was born in Wales in 1284. This baby Edward, as the fourth son of King Edward, and his wife Eleanor of Castile. The first two boys died young. The third, named Alfonso after his Castilian relatives, died later in 1284, leaving baby Edward as the new heir apparent. So is that why we have the Prince of Wales is the next up in terms of being the king? You know, it's
absolutely. This is where the tradition starts. Exactly.
Interesting.
So let's go back and look at the next 40 years of English history here through the events related to the proposed marriages for this now heir apparent, Edward of Carnarvon. So first, let's start with the story of Margaret. Boy, there's never any Margarets in any of these stories, right, Chris?
Like the middle name Marie. My wife's middle name, my sister's middle name Marie. Enough with it.
So let's give a little backstory to set up this first engagement. So we briefly explained the relationship and conflicts between Scotland and Norway in our last episode. Hint, hint, that's why we did this. So when King Sigurd the Crusader of Norway, what an amazing name, the great grandson of Harald Hardrada, who died in his attempt to conquer England in 1066, the throne of Norway went into dispute, kicking off 110 years of civil war. King Haakon IV eventually ended the conflict in 1240 and reigned until 1263. His grandson, Eric II, married Margaret, the daughter of King Alexander III of Scotland, who was incidentally married to Margaret of England, the sister of King Edward I. Whew. Eric and Margaret had just one daughter, who they, of course, named Margaret.
Right. Why not make this more confusing for people in 2025?
Exactly. In 1283. And then when Alexander III died in 1286, there was no male heir, though his second wife, Yolanda, was pregnant. This resulted in a miscarriage, unfortunately, and the crown then passed to the young Margaret of Norway. And this was recognized by the Scottish nobility.
So Edward I was helped negotiate and secure the safe passage. Edward I helped negotiate and secure the safe passage of Margaret to Scotland to take the throne. And as part of this treaty, young Edward of Carnarvon was betrothed to the Queen of Scotland. And while in transit, Margaret fell ill and died, likely of food poisoning. No foul play was suspected, and this sparked off a succession crisis in Scotland, with at least 13 claimants to the throne. And King Edward stepped in again and offered, perhaps demanded, that he arbitrate the dispute. How generous. In return, Scotland was required to recognize him as their overlord as a vassal state. And this kicked off what is known as the Great Cause. The rivals all had traced their lineage back to King Duncan I, who had reigned until his death in 1040. The strongest claims were by John Balliol. Please help me. Balliol. All right, I got close. And Robert de Bruce.
Yeah, so long story short, Edward ruled in favor of John Balliol, who was then made king in 1292. But 4 short years later, Balliol renounced his homage to Edward, resulting in an English invasion of Scotland. And this kicked off what is known as the First War of Scottish Independence. Fans of the movie Braveheart, like Mr. Spangle over here, will recognize the players we've discussed. And indeed, this is when William Wallace...
Totally historical and factual.
Yes, right. And this is when William Wallace appears on the stage of history. The depictions of the history in Braveheart are highly fictionalized, but we won't get into all that detail. Balliol was captured and imprisoned, and the Scots, led by Wallace, won a key early battle at Stirling Bridge in 1297. But the English responded with a big victory at Falkirk in 1298. Wallace then fled into hiding. Robert the Bruce, grandson of Robert de Bruce we just mentioned, formed an alliance with the English to help negotiate the peace. And then after the capture and execution of Wallace, Bruce was then crowned Robert I of Scotland. by the Scottish nobility in 1306. There's a good movie about that one too. And the English war would continue with Robert turning back on the English again, and the Scots winning a key victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. That wouldn't end the hostilities. They would continue off and on until finally the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, where England finally recognized Scottish independence via the House of Bruce.
So prior to the outbreak of the war with Scotland, Edward I arranged for the marriage of Edward of Carnarvon to Philippa of Flanders as an alliance during the Franco-Flemish War. And in the last episode, we hinted that the economic relationship between Flanders and England would be put to the test in the reign of Edward I. And we also mentioned the customs tax on wool earlier in this episode. And Flanders was ruled jointly by Guy Count of Flanders and his mother, Margaret. She is quite a fascinating character, but we can't get into all that right now. But during the final years of Henry III's reign, Margaret ordered the confiscation of wool from English merchants in Flanders, which is in modern-day France, maybe even close to Belgium, right? On the grounds of non-payment of customs. This put a freeze on the Anglo-Flemish wool trade until Edward I and Guy of Flanders were able to negotiate a treaty in 1274, and relations between England and Flanders would mostly improve over the coming decades.
Yeah, and then skipping ahead a couple of decades, we see an outbreak of naval skirmishes off the coast of Gascony, which is South France down by Spain, between the English and French ships. So King Edward I was called upon by the King of France, King Philip IV, to pay homage for his lands in France in 1294. Now, Philip IV was the grandson of Edward's crusading partner, St. Louis IX, and the whole process of paying homage to the French kings for lands held by the English crown had been a point of contention since the times of the Angevin Empire and even the early Norman kings. So when Edward refused to show up personally, Philip then ruled Gascony as being forfeited, and the war broke out between the French and English yet again.
We're going to hear that a lot, which leads up to how America was founded. The war started in Gascony, but a new front opened up when Philip IV decided to strengthen his grip on Flanders. And you'll recall from our last episode that Flanders had always tried to remain semi-autonomous, but Philip was intent on growing the strength of his monarchy. Again, remember that the French crown had a lot less central power at this point in history.
Yeah, so this led to a natural alliance between the English and the Flemish against the French. And as part of this alliance, Prince Edward was betrothed to Philippa of Flanders, who was the daughter of Guy. However, Philip IV then imprisoned Guy and Philippa, causing the betrothal to be revoked, and war broke out between France and the Anglo-Flemish alliance.
So we're not going to go into all the details here, but the Flemish would win a huge victory at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, but would be defeated by the French in the following years. A treaty in 1305 allowed Flanders to remain an independent county, but it placed harsh reparations on the region and acknowledged its place as a fief to the French crown.
Yeah, and so a truce back in 1297 had already ended the involvement with the English, and Edward, who always loved a good fight, could not afford multiple wars on multiple fronts, and acquiesced so he could focus his fighting on Scotland. But in that truce, mediated by Pope Boniface VIII, Edward I agreed to marry Margaret, the half-sister of Philip IV. And this was actually the second attempt for Edward to marry a half-sister of Philip. Shortly after the death of his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, in 1290, he was going to marry Blanche, but however, Philip deceived Edward and betrothed her to Rudolph of Habsburg. So this is another proximate cause of the war that we had just discussed.
So in addition to the marriage of Edward I and Margaret, the further peace between England and France, Prince Edward would be betrothed to Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip IV. And the pledge of marriage would take time to come to pass, as Isabella was only 2 years old at the time. The promise of King Edward I to the people of Wales would be fulfilled in 1301 when Prince Edward was given the title of the Prince of Wales. It's probably not what the Welsh were hoping for, but Edward was actually born in Wales. The title was conferred along the earldom of Chester, which, if you recall, had been held by King Edward I himself when he was the heir apparent. And since this time, with a few minor caveats and exceptions, The titles of Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester have been held by the heir apparent to the throne, as William holds it today.
That's right. And so King Edward I finally passed away and would die on campaign in Scotland in 1307, and the crown passed along to the new young King Edward II. His marriage with Isabella occurred in 1308 then in January, and the coronation proceeded in February. So novelty that was already developing that would hit center stage upon the death of was already developing upon the death of Edward I. A boyhood friend and son of a knight in the royal service of Edward I named Piers Gaveston increasingly became a favorite of the soon-to-be Edward II. And even before his accession to the throne, Gaveston had become a controversy and a pawn used in the tensions between King Edward I and his very anxious for power and money son, the Prince of Wales. Gaveston was even exiled once, perhaps simply as punishment directed to the prince. When Edward I died, the new king conferred the title Earl of Cornwall upon his friend Gaveston, recalling him back from exile. And when Edward II left England to go marry Isabella in France, he actually named Gaveston as the regent of England. And during the coronation ceremony and feast, Gaveston is recorded to have been playing roles usually reserved for the royal household or members of the nobility, which with a much longer tradition of power.
And you'll recall from episode 11 that the earldom of Cornwall had been held by Henry III's younger brother, Richard. And this was passed on to his son, who died without an heir. Thus, the estate reverted to the crown. However, it was a surprise to see Gaveston elevated beyond a simple baron to that of an earl, an earldom no less, that had most recently been held by a brother of the king. And these actions altogether certainly raised eyebrows and sowed discontent. We're not going to get into the more salacious controversies. I think you can read between the lines of the relationship between Edward and Gaveston, but there's plenty out there for you to find and discover on your own. And Gaveston's special place in the reign of Edward II would be an ongoing controversy with two more periods of exile forced upon Gaveston. The frustrated baronage imposed a council called the Lords Ordainers and issued the ordinances of 1311 to restrict the power of Edward II. And this effort was primarily led by the powerful Thomas of Lancaster, a cousin of Edward II, son of Edmund, the would-be king of Sicily, the younger brother of Edward I, who had amassed the earldoms of Lancaster, Leicester, Derby, Lincoln, and Salisbury. And Lancaster would oversee the trial and execution of Piers Gaveston in 1312. And after the aforementioned Battle of Bannockburn, which has been a humiliating loss for the English forces, Lancaster would effectively have more power than Edward II until 1318.
Yeah, and power would briefly shift then to Hugh Despenser the Elder, but when his son, Hugh Despenser the Younger, started to become the second coming of Piers Gaveston as the king's new favorite, baronial support again shifted, and a limited civil war known as the Despenser War led to the conviction and execution of Lancaster, and but deepening resentment of the Despensers.
Let's talk about the Queen, Queen Isabella. And during the entirety of her early reign of her husband, we know that she frequently maintained communication with her fathers and brother in France. Father and brother. She only had one father. This extended even to the papacy, as she asks for support from the barons against Piers Gaveston. And that said, she did remain loyal to her husband, and when Gaveston was at court, seemed to have found a workable relationship. She was, by all accounts, an intelligent and politically savvy woman, even at a young age. So, I mean, she was raised in royal households. And so while she ultimately tolerated Gaveston, she had more difficulty working with the Despensers. And toward the end of the Despenser War, Edward II more or less left Isabella high and dry, threatening her life. And the king and queen were separated. And by 1324, all of her lands and income had been confiscated. Her household was imprisoned, and her children were placed in the custody of the Despensers.
Yeah, and then by 1325, the question of homage for Gascony again arrived. So Philip IV died in 1314 and was followed by his three sons, the third of which, Charles IV, became king in 1322. And with the ill treatment of his sister Isabella, he demanded homage from Edward II. So he conferred the title of Duke of Aquitaine to his 13-year-old son, Edward, and sent him and Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission. This strategy turned on Edward II when Isabella used this as an opportunity to mobilize support for a new mission. In the summer of 1326, Isabella launched an invasion of England with the aim to wrest power from her husband. She was joined by Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron of the Welsh Marches, and other leading earls from Lancaster, the younger brother of Thomas, who was executed at the end of the Despencer War, Norfolk, the younger half-brother of Edward II, and Kent, the youngest half-brother of the king.
Isabella and Mortimer would be victorious, and we should probably mention that there is substantial historical agreement that they were romantically involved, but they usurped power, essentially. They aimed to make it legitimate and had Parliament formally depose Edward II in January of 1327. Prince Edward of Windsor took the crown at the age of 14. Isabella served as regent, and discontent began to build against her. The unresolved issues in Scotland, Gascony, and royal finances did not disappear, and she and Mortimer were seen, probably with good reason, as accumulating land and wealth for their own benefit. So Edward II would lead a counterstrike against his own mother and Mortimer.
The third.
Edward III, son against mother and his stepdad in October 1330.
Yeah. So we're going to come back to young King Edward III here in a little bit before we go back and summarize the financial and political developments that were happening under Edward I and II. So let's briefly look at the fates of our recent cast here. Edward II would be imprisoned by Mortimer and Isabella, and his true fate is lost to history. The most common outcomes hypothesized being death due to conditions of imprisonment, a grisly execution. We'll let you research those details. They're pretty gross. Carried out by Mortimer's men, or an escape from prison upon which he may have lived in exile until his own unknown death. Mortimer himself would then be convicted of treason later and executed. Isabella would be put on house arrest and ultimately resumed a lavish lifestyle as the mother of the king before dying finally in 1358.
I had Matt talk about Edward II's death because I would have told you. We will be coming back to Edward III in a little bit, but before we do that, we skipped over some important economic history, and that would have slowed down our main storyline. So we're going to jump back into the finances and economy of England under Edward I and II. I think we all recognize in our own day and age that we record this on the day of a shutdown, that finances are hugely important, even back then. And astute listeners would have picked up on our mention of the trade sanctions between Flanders and England earlier in the episode and asked, wouldn't the cessation of trade have caused civil unrest in the growing English merchant class? Of course you were thinking that. And the answer is yes, unless there was an alternative. And indeed, there was an alternative, Florence.
Yeah, so there's strong evidence that one of Edward I's crusading companions was a member of the Riccardi banking family of Florence in Italy. So the Riccardi were a prominent banking family, and it is likely that Edward learned financial innovations of the papacy from the Riccardi. And after his coronation, Edward was quick to secure a customs tax on wool exports from Parliament in the Statute of Westminster in 1275. Edward then privatized tax collection to the Riccardi. This steady stream of consistent income allowed Edward to borrow vast sums of money from the Riccardi with future customs collections as a collateral. Further, this helped create an additional export market with vast amounts of English wool being redirected for export to Florence. The Riccardi made money hand over fist, and Edward was able to shore up the treasury, which had been depleted by his father, Henry III.
So this happy arrangement helped fund his Welsh expedition and castle building projects. The union with the Riccardi also came at the expense of Jews in England. And in the 1275 Statute of the Jewry, Edward banned money lending from Jews and introduced new taxes and further extracted wealth from the Jews of England. This also included mandatory debt forgiveness. So 15 years later, Edward was back in deep debt and had his eyes turned on the Scots. Indications are that money lending did not cease, and in 1290, he confiscated remaining Jewish assets and expelled the Jews from England. And this was in response to pressure from his barons who he wanted to tax. their debts were transferred to the crown, and the Jews were scapegoated for the financial challenges of the realm.
Things then really heated up in the mid-1290s. Edward was fighting his military battles in Scotland, Gascony, opening up the new front on Flanders against the French. Edward again sought to raise taxes, and this is when he passed the maltot, or that bad tax, as a one-time wealth tax against wool assets. Then, when he asked his leading men to go to Gascony while he went to Flanders, the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford, respectively the Marshal and Constable of England, refused on the grounds that their feudal obligations only required them to accompany the king on campaign. The following exchange between Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, and the king was recorded by contemporaries, when the king demanded by his service, Edward I saying, "By God, Sir Earl, you shall either go or hang."
And Norfolk said, "By the same oath, O king, I will neither go or hang."
Yeah. So the king was then met with a formal complaint, which led to reissues of the Magna Carta and other concessions. And while Edward received a new tax, he also defaulted on his debt to the Riccardi, leading to a collapse of the bank due to a credit crunch, similar to what we saw with Lehman Brothers collapsing in the US in 2008.
So Edward was not the only European king having issues with taxation. Philip IV of France also had to raise significant funds for his military as well. And Philip debased the French currency, and to a larger degree than Edward, placed a tax on the religious community. This was met with a scathing papal bull issued by Pope Boniface VIII, asserting that all taxation of the clergy anywhere must be pre-approved by the Pope. Philip IV more or less ignored this, even under the threat of excommunication. And this was one factor that helped set up a period of schism in the Catholic Church when, in 1305, Philip IV helped steer the election of Pope Clement V. And the Pope would live in Avignon, France, instead of in Rome until 1376. Nearly all of these popes would be French, and this period is known as the Avignon Papacy and was accompanied by anti-popes in Rome, supported by the Holy Roman Empire and England. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there were two Vaticans, and you could visit two of them for a very long time.
Yeah.
So when you all start talking about our Presbyterian denominations and how many we got, you had two.
Over the course of the last century, we have seen a significant increase in baronial opposition to the crown, which has been met with periodic reissues of the Magna Carta and additional provisions to more clearly delineate the balance of power between the crown and nobility. At the same time, with the maturing of the legal system, we're starting to see the transition from a feudal monarchy to a monarchy where there is a more structured government and codification of laws. That's what's so important about this period. And these laws would then apply across the realm. And this concept is related to the notion of the English Constitution. You'll note that we've never had a constitutional event in England like we think of in American history, and that's because there is no written English Constitution. But what we are seeing here is the development of the sets of statutes, provisions, and customs, which are now referred to as the bedrock of the unwritten but still very real English Constitution.
This development is further seen in the disastrous reign of Edward II. At his coronation, his oath included a fourth clause, which is not in the written record or previous coronations. Edward II pledged to, quote, uphold the rightful laws and customs which the community of the realm have chosen. Further, it is important to note that his opposition used Parliament to secure his deposition.
Yeah. So now let's go back to pick up where we left off with Edward III. We're not going to cover his entire reign here in this episode. We're going to pick up his later years in the next episode as we cover the Black Death. But today we're going to focus on the beginning of what we know as the 100 Years' War. So fans of history may already know that the 100 Years' War lasted much longer than 100 years, but it was also not one continuous war. Since we're not here to talk the detailed military history, we're going to gloss over those details. This is a political history podcast, right? But this isn't a pretty important period. And so let's discuss those key events that take us into the mid-14th century.
The Capetian line of kings had a remarkable run, dating back to Hugh Capet in 987, and the line of direct male descendants ran unbroken for centuries. In an era of poor life expectancy, the Capetian kings routinely ruled for decades, often living into the late 50s, until the death of Philip IV in 1314. The shortest Capetian reign was that of Louis VIII, who was king for only a little more than 3 years, and he died with 7 male children. So Philip IV died with 4 surviving male children, but his oldest, Louis X, would last only 18 months before dying at age 26. Louis X's wife was pregnant at the time of his death, and prior to giving birth, the French nobility and lawyers ruled that no woman could take the crown. The baby turned out to be a boy, but died just 5 days later, and the crown reverted to Louis X's younger brother, who became Philip V. He too died without a male heir, less than 6 years on the throne. Philip IV had one more living son, who became Charles IV in 1322. However, 6 years later, the pattern would be repeated with the queen pregnant again. The child would be a daughter this time. So in 1328, the senior male line of Hugh Capet had become extinct. Succession was unclear, as the law of inheritance for the throne had not yet been tested for centuries.
Yeah,
but there were 3 contenders.
Yeah, 3 contenders here, and this is a very interesting period of transition for the French history. So Philip, the Count of Valois, was the grandson of Philip III, nephew of Philip IV, and son of Charles of Valois. Philip of Valois was 35 years old and had a son. Then we have Philip, the Count of Evreux, had similar bloodlines through a younger brother of Philip IV. However, Philip had married the daughter of Louis X. Thus, if inheritance could run through a female, even if the female herself could not have the inheritance, then he could become king by way of the wife of his wife through his own lineage. And third, dear listeners, was none other than Edward III.
Wait, England?
That's right. So if inheritance could pass through the female line, then Edward was actually closest in blood proximity to the crown as a direct grandson of Philip IV through his mother, Isabella.
Could you imagine the French lawyer that discovered that and was like, oh, who am I? I shouldn't tell anybody this.
Oh, we're going to have fun with this.
So the French decided that Philip of Valois was the rightful king, not the English king. History is unclear as to how much Edward pressed his claim in 1328. It seems that Philip of Valois, now Philip VI, was not immediately contested by Edward. It would be a matter of time before things would flare up, though. The county of Artois sat just to the west of Flanders and had for a time previously been a part of the county of Flanders. A succession dispute over Artois emerged in 1331 between Robert III of Artois, a trusted advisor of Philip VI from before his ascent to the throne, and his aunt, Mahat, the great-granddaughter of King Louis VIII and a mother-in-law of 2 kings of France, Philip V and Charles IV. Now, this whole story involves accusations of infidelity aimed at these future queens, the emerging power of the House of Burgundy, and a document forged by a woman who was having an open affair with a bishop. Robert of Artois would be caught in the forgery and fell deeply out of favor with Philip VI. His family was imprisoned, he was stripped of his lands, and he fled to German territory. Philip was intent on capturing him to bring him to justice and launched attacks on the Germans that harbored him. When Robert moved on to seek refuge in England, Edward III admitted him to his royal council to glean valuable intelligence on French affairs. Now, in response, Philip VI declared the Duchy of Aquitaine, or Duchy, what is it? It's not Duchy.
Duchy.
Yeah. Okay. Of Aquitaine as fortified by Edward. And this escalation led Edward to reassert his claim on the throne of France.
So this began the so-called 100 Years' War in 1337. This first phase of the war was referred to as the Edwardian phase, and we're going to summarize the first 22 years of the war here. So Edward would need to raise finances, of course, for the war at an effort and scale never seen before. He took on loans from 2 Italian banks, one of the wealthiest English merchants, raised taxes, seized wool, and applied a tax on that, and allied with Flanders for additional financial support. Edward ultimately put together his army and an invasion fleet and used Flanders as his entry point into France. The succession crisis in Brittany, and remember, that is the Breton Celtic peninsula in northwest France that kind of is quasi-independent, then launched a proxy war as a new front in the fight between Edward and Philip. England started to rallied to a series of wins beginning in 1345 with the famous victory in the Battle of Crécy in 1346, where the English were vastly outnumbered. They went on to take Calais by siege and continued raiding and pillaging through the north of France. The next big victory was the Battle of Poitiers in Poitiers, I believe, in 1356. And again, vastly outnumbered, the English were victorious, and this time under the leadership of the 26-year-old King Edward III. And his son, Edward, also known as the Black Prince, was already a celebrated war hero and heir to the throne. And in this battle, King John II of France, son of Philip VI, who we talked about earlier, had just died in 1350, was actually captured and taken prisoner by the English.
So negotiations proceeded. John would be held captive in London, and his 18-year-old son, Charles the Dauphin, was the name given to the heir apparent. That's their version of the Prince of Wales, the Dauphin, would serve as regent. France was collapsing on the verge of civil war and fractured due to the war and plague. Now, we'll talk about this more in the episode, but the Treaty of London was signed in 1359. England would regain the territories of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Aquitaine, Calais, and Ponthieu, as well as have look, I know the word because I play Civilization 6, but suzerainty over the Duchy of Brittany. This essentially restored the old Avignon Empire from the height of King Henry II. Except this time, England would hold sovereignty over lands, no longer a vassal fiefdom to the French king. The ransom for King John was set to 4 million écus. I don't know, man. Their money, 4 million of their money. From a standpoint of power and conquest, Edward III was viewed in 1359 as the greatest English king of all time.
And that is where we will end it today with episode 2 of season 2, or episode 13 overall, Chris.
Yeah, it's, I think the takeaway from this is like, oh, they're going to war, so they devalue the currency and raise taxes and borrow lots of money. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of the History of Modern Politics. I'm Chris Spangle. That's Matt Whitlow. We thank you so much for joining us. Please go check out the other episodes in this show. Stay tuned for more, and please share with your friends if you enjoyed it. We'll see you again on the next episode of the History of Modern Politics.
Thanks, everyone.